Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is fiction writer Anthony Grooms, the author of a previous volume of short stories, a novel, Bombingham, and now a brand new novel, The Vain Conversation. In addition to his writing and his teaching at Kennesaw State, Grooms has had the unusual experience of teaching in Ghana and in Sweden. I spoke with Tony Grooms in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Tony, it's nice to see you again.
It's nice seeing you, Don. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and I thank you especially. I mean, you've driven over from Atlanta to have this chat, and I'm very grateful. Yeah, it's a lot of trouble. It takes a couple of days out of your life. You have a new novel, The Vain Conversation, and it's an amazing new novel.
Well, thank you.
And we have time to talk about it, and we will. But I was doing a little reading, What's New with Tony Grooms, and I read that you have spent time teaching in Ghana and time teaching in Sweden. Now, you've had a career now at Kennesaw for how long?
23 years at
Lord,
Kennesaw.
that long.
I know, and I'm only 25, so I don't know how that, that happened.
I would never have guessed it was as long as that, but yeah, time does go right by. But you've had a couple of adventures out in Africa and in Europe.
Yeah.
What is it like? How are they the same? How are they different? How are they different from Kennesaw? How are they different from each other?
Well, it's very different, in fact, in both cases. Ghana more so than Sweden. In Ghana, I taught at the University of Cape Coast, which is in a small city located about 75 miles up from the capital on the coast. Its distinction is that it has the largest, they're called slave castles.
Yes.
I prefer to call them slave prisons, but they're forts, actually.
It's Jesse's first chapters.
Yes, exactly.
In Homegoing.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, you were there.
Yes, exactly. That's where she began, she begins her novel there in the Cape Coast Castle. And then just a mile and a half down the coast is the Elmina Castle, which is the oldest of the slave castles in West Africa. It's a place that Columbus visited before he came to the New World. So there's a lot of history there, and one of the things that was really interesting to me was how little the native people there, the natives in the town, knew about what actually happened at the castle. It was a tourist place, and tourists would come and get their tours, and you get a spiel about what went on. But when you go out into the streets, there's this huge edifice in the middle of the town that people kind of ignore. But anyway, at the university, there was, first of all, the culture of the university is very different. The resources are very scarce.
I'm sure.
So I had to bring books, which did not arrive, and therefore they were.
Were you a Fulbrighter? I didn't ask.
Not for Ghana. Ghana, I was on exchange from Kennesaw. But what was so wonderful about the students was that they were so eager to learn.
Oh, yeah.
And professors were king. You know, you walked around and the student would come, may I carry your books for you? I was very uncomfortable with that idea, but they did. So that was in some ways a very eye-opening experience to live in the third world and to see how people get along in the third world, and to in some ways adjust to that pace. And one of the interesting things that a Western friend said about living in Ghana was that you might start the day with 10 tasks you need to do. In the United States, you could get all 10 done in an hour or so, but you wouldn't have had a face-to-face conversation. But in Ghana, you would have 100 face-to-face conversations, and maybe you would get one of the things done. But so the people were very warm and welcoming, and I love that. The university was under-resourced and a bit disorganized.
The tourism. Let me pause for a moment. The people who came to see these castles, were they there on slavery tourism?
Some of them were, yes.
So they knew sort of what they were meaning to see and learn.
It's really
even if the natives didn't.
Yeah, what is interesting was the attitude of African Americans, because I think African Americans, first of all, tended to have very emotional experiences going there. They also tended, I think, and I said we.
What about you?
Well, I'm cynical, so so I had maybe a slightly different reaction than, say, my wife, who tends. I mean, she was weeping and that kind of thing. But one of the stories we learned in the Elmina Castle, for example, was that once out of that door of no return, in 3 years they were gone. And I raised my hand at that point and said, well, that's not exactly true since I'm here. And then the tour guide backed up and said, oh yes, by the way, there is a Twi-speaking community in Brazil. So there was this sense in the narrative that was being presented that the enslaved people didn't survive in the New World.
That's the prevailing mythology in that spot.
I'm not sure if it's prevailing, but that was one of the stories that we got. And once it was challenged, the tour guide backed off of it. And of course, there was no complicity on the parts of the Fanti and the Shanti.
Were these slaves all volunteers?
According to their narrative.
I see.
You know, somehow 60 Europeans came in and for 300 years processed something on the order of I think it was 1,500 people every 3 months through this Cape Coast Castle. And somehow the Fantis and the Shantis didn't know about it or something like that.
Well, then they should read Homegoing too.
Yeah, in fact. But a very different experience from teaching in the United States. And then I got a Fulbright to go to Sweden, where I had yet a slightly different experience.
Slightly, I would say.
Well, the Swedes have a reputation of being very reserved. The university I taught at is, in English, is called the University of Southern Stockholm, or University College of Southern Stockholm. And it is a university that caters primarily to immigrants, primarily from Eastern Europe and also from the Middle East. So there weren't really that many what some people call typical Swedes in the university, although many of the students there had, their families had been in Sweden for generations, but they still considered themselves Greek or Yugoslav.
There was a big collection of Yugoslavs in Stockholm.
And when I was there was a huge collection of a huge community of Iraqis because of the war. So beginning the Swedish attitude, I come in and I say to the group, I'm being really cool. So you can call me Tony, you know, because I'm the cool professor. And one student looked at me and she said, well, I'm glad we can call you by your first name because we call all of our professors by their first names.
Oh, I did not know that.
And then I said, well, your paper will be due on May 3rd or whatever. And one student raised her hand. She said, I'm planning on having a baby that day. I said, oh, well, I guess you won't be turning in your paper. No, we talk about these things. We negotiate these things. And so we negotiated a date. That date came. There were no papers. And my friend, another professor, said, well, you know, they don't fail. If they don't turn in a major project, they get another chance to do it. And they can keep doing it and keep doing it, keep delaying. One student really didn't like what I had to say about his paper, so he just dropped away, to wait until I disappeared, and then he would find some other person. So it's a very different system, but what I found was that the papers, when they finally came, were very good.
They were on their terms, though, weren't they?
They were definitely on their terms. As someone implied to me, just because you're a professor doesn't mean you're better than I am.
Oh.
You might know more than I do, but
and what were you teaching?
We're all citizens in this social
What
democracy.
were you teaching in these two places? Were you teaching
I was
American literature in some way?
In some way. I was asked to do a series of lectures focused on post-colonialism. So there was American literature involved in that, and American history. The one question that I remember so well and really suggested to me where I was and how fundamentally different this culture was actually showing a slide of a picture of Thomas Jefferson. And one of the students raised his hand and asked, this Thomas Jefferson, was he white or black?
Oh.
And a question that surprised me. They also thought for some reason that Coretta King was white. But here's the thing, they knew Tupac. and Lil Wayne and all of the Atlanta rappers, and when they found out I was from Atlanta, they were, do you know these rappers? And I said, look at me, ask me about Aretha Franklin. Don't ask me about these younger musicians, but it was again a very engaging experience to be with those students, and but a different pace than the United States students.
Yes, different pace, different relationship, and our assumptions about what they may or may not know about the United States. Always shaky.
Yeah,
always.
It's easy to be confused from an American perspective because it seems that everybody speaks English, and it's American English that they're speaking to you.
Right.
But when you dig a little deeper, you will find out that no, they know as much about U.S. history as we know about Swedish history.
Right.
So I know something about Charles XII going to Russia.
You do now, anyway.
I do now. Yeah.
Well, that is those experiences teaching abroad. I have done that, and I have loved it, and I have learned a great deal from it, and I'm always interested to hear how other people do it and what it means to them. And it's not much different from my own, except for obviously the.
Where were you?
Oh, I was a year in Yugoslavia. I was a year in Romania, and I've taught a lot in Ireland and in England. But Yugoslavia and Romania were the real thing.
Okay, yeah.
But you're a novelist. You're a fiction writer.
And that's my claim.
And the last time we spoke, you had published Bombingham, a novel set in Birmingham, and a collection of stories. Now there is a new novel, The Vain Conversation. And The Vain Conversation, there are two things that we can begin with. One is, that title has meaning. It is a quote of it. And the other is that the novel has its origins in an actual historical event in Georgia. The title of the novel.
The title of the novel is taken from the New Testament, from the Epistle of Peter, I forget which, but it's in the book.
Yes.
And it refers to the tradition of sin. So it's the vain conversations of our fathers. So and the question that I'm asking in the novel has to do with how do we atone, or to use another word, how do we redeem ourselves for this tradition of race violence in particular.
Right.
But it also puns on the idea of conversations around race. What's a vain conversation? I think you find them on television every night, whether you're looking at CNN or Fox News. These are people pontificating and yelling and doing what.
Hello.
But I do think there are fruitful conversations going on all the time, typically in quiet corners where people meet on one-to-one basis and discover who they are. And it was engaged with a man who was telling about researching an enslaved man who had been owned by one of his forebearers.
Sure.
And then taking that research and taking it to the enslaved man's descendants and meeting with them and talking. And they even did a genetic test to see whether or not they were related. And they found out that they weren't biologically related, but they were related otherwise.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, meaningful conversation across differences, and it's not just race, but any kind of difference that people have, is what I'm promoting around the book. This idea of having these conversations.
There are not a lot of fruitful conversations in the book. They're
No,
at the very maybe at the very beginning. This, based on an actual historical event in which two black couples were murdered.
Yeah. In Georgia, it's called the Moore's Mills lynching, or the Moore's Landing lynching, or sometimes Moore's Ford lynching.
Yeah.
And it happened in 1946 in Walton County, Georgia, which is not all that far from Athens. And I learned about it from the Atlanta Journal and Constitution in about 91, when I was reading about Clinton Adams, who was a witness at 10 years old, a witness to the murders. And at that point, he said that he had spent, at that point, most of his adult life just thrown off course. He was, in a phrase, a witness without a voice. He was afraid to talk about it.
Right.
He was afraid that the people that he had seen at the site of the murder would somehow seek vengeance against him.
Yeah.
But in 91, he came clean. This reopened the investigation. Interestingly enough, there had been an investigation in the 40s because it was such a horrific murder. But the investigations reopened. And so for a long time, both the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were investigating. And just recently, they concluded that the old person's unknown kind of a conclusion.
Yeah, cold case.
Cold case,
no
yeah.
doubt. There's early in your novel, we have something that I've been seeing more and more. I've been seeing it in a lot of fiction, and I've seen it written up. Wayne Greenhaw writes about it in his book about the Montgomery bus boycott, and that is the returning black veteran. And it is, to me, that has always stood, whenever that particular issue arises, it always seems to be like a powerful contradiction, a powerful paradox. Here you have an individual who has just performed 4 years of extreme patriotic service, given up years of his life, risked his life, fought for the country, and this was true in World War I. After World War I, it was true after World War II. It was true even after the Civil War with black soldiers who had fought for the Union. And instead of being honored, which you might think, the reverse is true. And this is the origin, this is the beginning of your novel. This returning black veteran terrifies the local folk. Is
and the white veteran also terrifies them because he's changed. He has seen the world in a way that the folks who stayed behind haven't seen the world, and now he's willing to extend himself to the black man, and that is also terrifying to the white community.
They've been brothers in arms.
They've been brothers,
so to speak, in Europe, even though they were not.
No, they were segregated units.
But when they returned, they realized this in each other.
And part of that too is the syndrome that people who've been in battle have a very difficult time talking about that experience to people who've not been in battle.
Right.
And so they also find that bond that they understand what it was like to be fearful, to shoot people and so forth. So this is part of their bonding. So in the beginning of the novel, they do bond. But I've always been interested. My mother's father had a brother who went away to North Africa in World War II and was killed. I never met him, of course, but his picture was in my grandmother's living room for for all of my growing up. So I was always interested in that aspect of black experience. And then, of course, the Vietnam War touched me. I did not serve in the Vietnam War, but I always thought for a long time I was in a lottery for the Vietnam War. But as it turned out, I was my birth date was not in the last lottery. But I've always been in some ways connected that way. And interestingly, too, we weren't anti-military in my family. We always thought that the military was an economic leg up.
Oh, well, supposed to be.
Yeah, so, you know, that was our thinking about it.
Well, you have this relationship between the two men who are veterans. The white man dies, and the black man helps his family. Apparently this is intolerable, that this black man would aid the widow and son of the deceased white man. It goes down very badly in the community. And generally speaking, this is the kind of stress that leads to, we're going to call it a lynching. It's a shooting, of course, but
it's a lynching.
Generically, it's a lynching.
That's a funny, you know, one of the characters later on, they have this discussion whether you really need to have a rope when you have a lynching.
Right,
you know.
right.
In my opinion, the lynching is any extrajudicial murder.
Sure.
So,
but the people involved in that incident, there's a man named Venable, who I think of as a, pardon the expression, typical bad guy in a novel like this, and the sheriff, who is very much the archetype bad guy. And then you have this Jax fellow, and there's a conversation late in the novel. And as soon as the returning black veteran is killed, all the characters essentially are white. And they have these conversations, and one of the conversations is about the burden, the difficulty of carrying on as a white person and behaving properly as a white person in Georgia in the 1940s. I was trying to get into your mind a little bit at a distance. What are you thinking about when you have this? When Jack says you have to behave like a white man, it's your responsibility.
Well, this is part of the social conformity that we all deal with. You have to behave like a professor. Right? You know, at my universities, we've had some professors who didn't behave like professors, and soon they weren't professors. But we are all, in a sense, playing social roles, and not in a disingenuous way. But our society expects certain things of us. Right. And in a society that promotes white supremacy, it expects that white men play a certain role, and that is the role of the supreme person. So for example, early on when the veteran Henson reaches out to the black veteran, that is, he's breaking out of the role. He's not playing the role that he's expected. And Jax is a character who remembers, he has a sense memory practically of his Irish forebears who lost their land to the British colonialists. And he has this strong sense that, of the importance of land. But at the same time, he doesn't fit into the local gentry. So he is kind of a fish out of water.
Yes. Venable is gentry, so to speak. He's the planter. And Jax is sort of a white land owner who is never going to be on the top shelf.
Never quite.
No. The character with the witness to the events. Your book becomes a study in the effects of unredeemed guilt. This boy, the 10-year-old boy who witnesses the lynching, witnesses the killing of the 4 people, is damaged by it for life, and he's innocent. He hasn't done anything. It's Dostoevskian, this
Oh, thank you.
business of yours. You mean it to be, no doubt, right?
Well, no, this is the first time I've ever heard that comparison.
But you know what I'm saying, though.
Yeah, but I did mean to explore this idea of guilt, to explore this idea of what it means to try to redeem oneself.
Yeah.
You know, this event is not isolated. These lynchings, none of our history is isolated from what follows, nor is it localized. So these things spread out in interesting ways. One person is affected in one way who affects another person, and so forth and so on. Right. And so this is what happens to Lonnie Henson.
Lonnie Henson is ruined in a way.
Yeah, he's thrown off course. He doesn't really understand what kind of moral core he has, if he has any moral core. He just kind of blows in the wind. And he has some nice adventures, but
but he is a fragmented, he's a fractured personality. He doesn't know who he is, and he's not going to know. And we will not speak of the end of the novel because that's another story. But we have to speak. We have to end anyway. I know that you're a hard-working writer, and you've got a whole lot of projects going. We only have a minute. What should we look for in the near future?
Well, I do have 2 novels that are completed and are circulating. One is kind of a follow-up on Bombingham, but for younger readers. It's called Josie of Birmingham, and I think Alabamians will like it because it really explains in some ways why black people wanted to stay in Birmingham even during the height of segregation.
Yeah.
Josie wants to go to the moon. She wants to be a scientist, and so she has to figure out how to do that in segregated Birmingham, which means segregating or desegregating the schools. Right. The other is set in Sweden, and it follows a Vietnam War vet who has deserted. A lot of people don't know that about 1,000 U.S. soldiers deserted, and they were living in Stockholm at the end of the Vietnam War.
Now that is intriguing right off the bat. As a regular reader, I think I want to see that. Tony, we're out of time. Thank you very much. This has been a pleasure. Thank you for coming over.
It's been my pleasure.